In the 17th century, a storm was a death sentence, especially for giants like the war galleon. Yet in the same storm, a handful of outcasts in a mere wooden shell were not just surviving. They were harnessing the hurricane's power for their own ends. This was a paradox that defied all the laws of the sea. We will uncover the single secret that made this possible, and it has nothing to do with the strength of the ship. The hurricane of 1715 off the coast of Florida was a death warrant for the Spanish treasure fleet. 11 of the 12 giant treasure-laden galleons sank to the bottom. It was the equivalent of a plane crash, but on the scale of an entire fleet. Their enemy wasn't just bad weather. It was waves the height of a 3-story building and wind that could tear the skin from your face. A wall of water that left no chance of survival. In scientific terms, a Category 1 hurricane has winds reaching 95 miles per hour, the speed of a race car. And in 1933, the USS Ramapo, a U.S. Navy tanker, recorded a wave 111 feet high, the height of an 11-story building. This is what they faced. This brings us to the fundamental contradiction. The best engineers of the era were building ships that became death traps. Meanwhile, pirates knew something that the admirals of the Royal Navy did not, something that eluded figures like Samuel Pepys and brilliant shipwrights like Phineas Pett, creator of the Sovereign of the Seas, the most powerful ship of its time. To grasp the genius of their solution, we must first understand the dead end everyone else was sailing into, a trap built from Admiralty pride and oak planks as thick as a man's arm. They were building an impregnable fortress, not realizing there are no walls to hide behind in the open ocean. Consider the flagship of the era, the Sovereign of the Seas. Its name meant ruler of the seas. Its hull was made of a double layer of oak up to 2 feet thick, armed with over 100 bronze cannons, and crewed by more than 800 men. This wasn't just a ship. It was a floating city fortress, a symbol of an empire's unbreakable might. Its primary purpose was to endure a cannon battle, to take the hit of an enemy cannonball. Its strategy in a storm was the same. Head into the waves, hold the course at any cost. This was like building a skyscraper in an earthquake zone without a flexible foundation. All its colossal strength and mass turned against it when the water beneath began to heave. It was the mighty oak that doesn't bend, but breaks in a hurricane. When a giant wave slammed its side, the deafening crack of timber would drown out the roar of the storm. Masts snapped like matchsticks under the weight of soaked sails. But the true point of failure was often unexpected. It wasn't the hull that gave way first, but the rudder. Massive waves would tear it from its hinges, and the multi-ton giant would instantly become an uncontrollable log. Or the hull would begin to breathe, flexing under the impacts until the caulking between the planks popped out, opening hundreds of small leaks that could turn the hold into a swimming pool in minutes. Now, imagine yourself as the captain of this behemoth. Your instinct screams, hold on, fight, don't give up. Any other order seems like cowardice, and it was precisely this heroic instinct, this faith in their own strength, that killed them. The pirates, however, acted against instinct. This is a classic cognitive trap known today as escalation of commitment. The captain had invested everything in his course, his honor, his orders from the Admiralty, the lives of hundreds of men. To admit the need to turn and run was tantamount to admitting defeat, not to the storm, but to himself. The pirates looked at the same storm and saw not an enemy, but an environment. Uncontrollable, yes, deadly, absolutely, but an environment with its own laws. Instead of trying to break these laws, they chose to use them. The core principle: if your opponent's strength is incomparably greater than yours, do not resist. Go with its flow. This is the pure principle of judo applied to naval tactics. The founder of judo, Jigoro Kano, said, "Yield to conquer." The pirates may not have known these words, but they intuitively discovered this fundamental law. It was easier for them to adopt this philosophy. Their sloops and schooners, like the Queen Anne's Revenge or the Royal Fortune, were built not for line-of-battle combat, but for pursuit and escape. They had a shallower draft, allowing them to literally ride up a wave rather than crash into it. The very design of their ships embodied a philosophy of speed over brute force. Their weakness became their greatest advantage. It forced them to be smarter. They had no rigid regulations or admiralty pride. Their sole objective was to survive, not to save face. Their first practical step was an act of complete surrender to the fight. They would turn the ship's stern to the waves and wind to run with the storm. In nautical practice, this maneuver is called running before a gale. For a naval captain, this was a disgrace, equivalent to fleeing the battlefield. For a pirate, it was simply the most logical way to stay alive. But just running with the wind is also a death sentence. The ship begins to yaw, is inevitably turned broadside to a wave, and then it's over. To survive in this torrent, they needed an anchor, but not an anchor that grips the seabed, an anchor that grips the water itself. They needed a way to anchor themselves not to the bottom, but to the storm itself, to latch onto the chaos to find stability within it. It sounds like madness, but this paradox held the key to survival. This device was called a sea anchor, and it was brilliant in its simplicity. Forget high technology. It was just a few planks nailed together in a cross and covered with a piece of old tarred canvas, essentially an underwater parachute. The idea was as old as seafaring itself. Hints of it can even be found in the Bible in the description of the Apostle Paul's shipwreck. But it was the pirates of the Golden Age who perfected its use, turning this primitive device into their ultimate trump card against the Royal Navy and nature itself. Here's how it worked. It was deployed from the ship's bow on a very long line. The anchor would sink, open under the water's pressure, and create immense drag. This taut line, like a steel leash, kept the ship's bow from overtaking the stern or yawing from side to side. The sea anchor functioned like the tail of a kite. It doesn't stop the kite in the sky, it just keeps it from tumbling in the wind. Similarly, the anchor didn't bring the ship to a full stop. It created a point of stability in the water that constantly held the vessel's bow in the only safe direction, downwind. Now, see the storm through the eyes of the helmsman. He is no longer wrestling with the wheel in a desperate attempt to turn against the waves. His job has changed. Now, he only needs to make slight adjustments, feeling how the sea anchor holds them on an invisible tether. He isn't steering the ship in the traditional sense. He is conducting its glide through the chaos. That line became an extension of his nervous system. He could feel its tension through the entire hull, as if a giant unseen hand were steadying them in the current. He was no longer a fighter. He had become a partner in a dance with the elements. The ship was no longer an obstacle for the waves to break. It had become part of the system. It was lifted onto a crest and would slide down its face like a surfer. The storm's energy no longer destroyed it. It simply moved it through space. And this wasn't just elegant, it was brutally effective. While the massive galleon wasted its strength in a pointless struggle, breaking masts and exhausting its crew, the pirate sloop conserved both. They emerged from the storm not just alive, but with a ship ready for action and a crew that had rested while the storm did all the work. But this effectiveness concealed a single, absolute risk called broaching. This happens when the ship's stern is caught by a wave's crest. In that moment, the rudder is lifted out of the water and the vessel loses steerage. The bow, meanwhile, digs into the trough of the preceding wave. The ship becomes a lever that the next wave easily turns sideways and capsizes. It's the fastest and surest way to die in a storm. The sea anchor prevented the bow from being overtaken, thus averting this fatal scenario. The warship's strategy was that of a boxer trying to block a sledgehammer. The result was predictable. The pirate's strategy was that of an Aikido master who doesn't meet force with force. He moves off the line of attack, captures the energy of the blow, and redirects it. The sea anchor was that redirection. On a scale of 1 to 10, where 1 is madness and 10 is genius, this technique is an 11. For an admiral accustomed to total control, surrendering his ship to the elements was tantamount to cowardice. For a pirate whose goal was survival, it was the highest form of control, achieved by abandoning the illusion of control. For an old-school admiral like John Benbow, who valued formation and discipline above all else, such a maneuver would have been an act of insubordination. And that is the difference. The admiral managed a fleet, the pirate managed survival. These are two different value systems, and in a storm, only one of them worked. Success depended on a perfect balance. The length of the line, the size of the anchor, and the minimal sail area left aloft all had to be chosen perfectly. Too much drag, and the next wave would swamp the stern. Too little, and the ship would bury its bow in the wave ahead. The line holding the anchor had to be the best in the hold, woven from the strongest hemp. Its length was critical, typically several times the length of the ship, to absorb the shocks. Too short, and it wouldn't cushion the jolts. Too long, and it would get tangled. This wasn't just a technique. It was ruthless marine engineering based on hundreds of trials and fatal errors. But this mechanism was only half of the equation. The other half was not made of planks and hemp. It was made of people. Give a sea anchor to an inexperienced naval crew, and they would perish even faster. The secret was not in the tool, but in the organism that wielded it. Contrary to stereotypes, a pirate ship was often a model of social engineering. Unlike the Royal Navy with its iron-fisted discipline and the vast gulf between officers and sailors, many pirate ships were floating democracies. The captain was elected by vote. The plunder was divided equally. This created a level of cohesion unattainable in a hierarchy built on fear. They survived not because they feared orders, but because each man held personal responsibility for his shipmate's life. In a storm, this bond turned them into a single organism. The lookout on the mast, blinded by spray, would scream a warning about an approaching rogue wave. The helmsman, who couldn't see the wave but trusted the lookout's voice completely, would already be preparing the wheel. The crew below, in a split second, would douse the last scrap of sail to reduce speed. All of this happened amid the deafening roar of the storm, without a single wasted word and with no room for error. Their teamwork resembled not a ship's crew, but a Formula One pit crew. Everyone knew their role without an order. Their movements were honed to instinct. But the price of a mistake wasn't a lost race. It was instant death for everyone. One tangled line, one wrong turn of the wheel, one moment of panic, and the ship, with all aboard, would disappear forever. Add to this the freezing water, the bone-jarring motion, and an exhaustion so profound it blurred the line with reality. Hands were worn raw on icy wet ropes. Their composure was not an absence of fear. It was the ability to operate at the absolute limit when the body had already given up, but the will had not. From this extreme state, a universal survival protocol emerges. 4 steps we can take with us from the 17th century. First, map the storm. Acknowledge the true power of the force you are facing without illusions. Second, the pirate's turn. Stop beating your head against the wall. Start moving with the current, not against it. Third, anchor in the chaos. Find your point of stability not outside the system, but within it, a stabilizer to hold you in the flow. And fourth, dance with the wave. Give up the illusion of total control to gain real influence. Conduct, don't fight. This algorithm works far beyond the ocean. It applies to business, personal crises, and creativity. Imagine a startup founder during a market crash. The warship strategy is to burn through the last of the investor's cash, trying to maintain an old, broken business model. The pirate strategy is to acknowledge the new reality, instantly pivot the company toward the market's changing needs, and use their small, agile team as the sea anchor that stabilizes their course in the chaos. Sometimes, to win, you simply have to stop fighting. And this brings us to the central question of our investigation. What really saved them? A simple device of wood and canvas, or a revolutionary mindset that the philosopher Nassim Taleb would today call anti-fragility, the ability to grow stronger from chaos? Write a single word in the comments. Device, if you believe technology was the key, or mindset, if you think their way of thinking was what mattered most. Let's see which camp wins.